All right. So I'm really appreciative of having this opportunity to share a little bit with you about my experiences with ash trees and with the emerald ash borer. This is not going to be like really a biology talk, but it's a lot more about sort of my personal experience um, over the years, and so it's very personal to me. I tend to get kind of emotional about it, so we'll see how emotional I get by the end of the talk. Um, this is a map that some of you may have seen before. It basically shows how the emerald ash borer has invaded the United States. It was believed to have started in Detroit, brought in probably in packing crates, and from there it spread out in basically a circular pattern. So my hometown, which is Lima, Ohio, is right about where this star is here. And you can see from the map that it was invaded very early in the emerald ash borer invasion around the year 2006. So I think it was 2002 when it was introduced. So it was within the first few years of the invasion. So I'm going to talk about several places in this talk that are very special to me. So just for context, this is where Lima is in comparison to Columbus and Indianapolis and some other places like that. I grew up on a farm there, and in the 1970s, my dad bought a farm which we called the Bluelick Road farm because it was on Bluelick Road. And in the corner of that farm, there was a woods, which, for lack of a better name, we called the Bluelick Road Woods. This was like a very interesting spot, and one of the reasons why it's interesting, I'm going to just throw in a little bit of history, historical trivia about Lima. Lima was actually the oil capital of the world in 1887. Most people think of Texas or Saudi Arabia, but Lima was the largest producer of oil in 1887. There were oil wells all over the place, oil tanks, things like that. But now if you go around Lima, obviously it's not a major oil area, but you can still see some remnants of the oil industry. On one side, on the east side of this Bluelick Road farm, there are actually some wooden oil tanks that are left over. The production of oil kept going into the 1900s. I don't know when it actually stopped, probably in maybe the 1940s. But those oil tanks are still there. So one of the things that was very cool to us as kids when we would go into the Bluelick Road woods was that there was a part of the woods where there was a bunch of, I guess you could call it, wreckage from the oil industry. There was an old school bus and a building where they had like a pump, and they had these rod lines that ran the wells. And then and this was like one of our favorite things, this old car that was sort of a landmark in the forest. And so our sort of love and affection for this woods has continued on throughout the years. These are my two daughters in 2006. They're grown up now. But and this was a day when we went in the woods with their grandpa, my dad, to look at the big trees. One of the reasons why I just love this woods, there's actually several woods on my dad's farm, but this is the only one that wasn't logged recently. And it has a number of very huge trees. And I could just kick myself that I don't actually have any photos of the ash trees there. This particular tree, I think, is an oak. But the largest tree, all of the largest trees in that woods were ash trees. And unbeknownst to us, in 2006, this was right around the time when those trees were being invaded by the emerald ash borer. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on this photo of my girls goofing around with the car. If you look at the background, you can actually get a little bit of a feel for the diversity of the woods. So over here, I'm not that great at telling trees by their bark, but this is an oak tree. This is a honey locust tree here, which is like fairly common. And over here we see the telltale sign of ash bark. So this is what you would have seen in that woods. So like I said, the biggest trees in there were all ash trees. This is my brother hugging, again, it's not one of the ash trees, but hugging one of the big trees in the woods. So, so like I said, there were sort of behind the scenes, this woods was being attacked, and I'll come back to it a little bit later. The other place in that area that is really interesting and special to me is the area around Bluffton. So another one of your sort of historical factoids is a lot of people didn't know that Northwest Ohio was called the Great Black Swamp. There's actually a huge swamp, looks pretty much like this, that covered much of the northwest corner of the state. And Lima and Bluffton were not in the Great Black Swamp, but they were close to the edge of it. Just to give you a little historical perspective about what things were like, I have this really cool letter that my great-great-great-grandfather, who was living north of Lima, sort of on the edge of the Great Black Swamp, wrote back home to his parents in Virginia. Dear Father, Mother, I embrace this opportunity to write a few lines to you, having written to you in a former letter about our being unwell, as the country around us has been smartly brushed with sickness, such as fever and ague. We also had to suffer somewhat along with the rest of the neighbors. And so I've highlighted the word ague because that's basically the word that they used in that time period for malaria. We think of malaria as being a problem that happens in Africa or South America or something like that. But at this time, malaria, because of all the mosquitoes that were associated with the wet areas, there was actually a lot of malaria there, and the early settlers of the area suffered with it a lot. So that's just to sort of set the context for this other place that's special to me, and that's the Bluffton University Nature Preserve. I went to Bluffton, it was called Bluffton College at that time, now Bluffton University. And so when I was a student there, we spent a lot of time going out to the woods. It's a very moist woods. So the kind of trees you see there, like bur oak, white ash, swamp white oak, and honey locust, which are kind of wet woods trees, were quite common in this area. And when I was towards the end of my career, I was taking a general ecology class, and one of our labs in that class was to go out in the East Woods, which is this area I'm pointing at with my cursor here. And we had a section that we were supposed to do a tree sampling in. So I'm like a real saver. I guess you could call me a pack rat. And so when Heather asked me to do this talk, I wanted to see if I could actually find my lab notebook from May 1981. And sure enough, I was able to find my lab notes from the vegetation analysis experiment. And one of the things that was really striking to me is that this page here, I have the counts and measurements for shagbark hickory, slippery elm, Ohio buckeye, but you can see the white ash section sort of overflowed beyond the space that I had set out for it and started oozing its way up the margins. So in this particular area, white ash trees were super common. They're really one of the dominant trees in that forest. So just to follow up with that, because everybody wants to know what happened at the end of the story, my lab partner in that experiment was my girlfriend, who's now actually my wife, Carol Baskauf, who teaches at Austin Peay State University. And the professor is actually my father-in-law now, Morris Kaufman. And his home is right on the edge of this nature preserve. So since I graduated from college, I've actually been back to this forest many times when I go to visit my in-laws, because it's basically in their backyard. So to sort of pick up the timeline where we left off in 2008, this was the time when the emerald ash borer started to arrive. So for those of you who don't really know what the emerald ash borer is, it's a type of a beetle. This photo here is very enlarged. They're actually very tiny beetles, but the adult beetles are really not the life stage that we're concerned about. It's the larvae that do all of the damage. And so the larvae attack the tree from the inside, and then when they've completed their life cycle, they bore a D-shaped hole in the bark like this. And then when they come out of the hole, that's the point at which they turn into the adults, and then they fly looking for another ash tree to lay their eggs in it. So people started noticing these D-shaped holes. They started noticing that the trees were looking sick. But by the time people really realized what was going on, it was too late to do anything about it. Once you start seeing the visible signs of damage to the tree, it's really too late to do any sort of treatment. And if you're wondering why, the reason is because the damage is all being done underneath the bark where it's invisible to us. The larvae crawl around in the cambium layer, which is that green living layer that's underneath the outer bark, and they just in the many hundreds chew their way, making these things that are called galleries. So here's what it looks like on an actual tree, and then this is kind of an enhanced view, so you can see they're basically wandering around chewing the bark. And this is not something that just happens a little bit. This is a video that I took showing what it looks like. And from that video, you can see that literally these trees are being eaten from the inside out. And by the time you start seeing the exit holes, they've basically been eaten alive. So, and this is actually my father-in-law's front yard. So because of his concern about these big ash trees falling over and hitting his house, he had to pay for contractors to come in and take them down. So what you should notice is the size of the stumps. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here, there's one here. And, you know, compared to a lot of the other trees, these were really some of the largest trees in that woods. And here you can see another view of his front yard with the piles of limbs and the stack of huge logs up here in the front. So in terms of the biomass, or the total amount of living material in the forest, the ashes were very significant in this particular forest because it was a dominant tree there. As I said, I've gone back there many times. Here's a photo from 2015 actually inside the nature preserve where the trees were not removed. And you can see now that it's been 7 or 8 years after the trees were killed, they're starting to lean and fall over. Some of them are already on the ground. And so, you know, back in the forest of my parents, those huge ash trees now are at the point where they're starting to fall over. And because they're so huge, when they fall down, they take a lot of they hit the branches of the surrounding trees, and they make these very large holes in the canopy. So now when you hike around in there, there's a lot of brush and things coming up, because what used to be a kind of dark closed canopy is now a very open area. So the loss of these ash trees has been a really huge loss for that area. So I was like super depressed about this, and partly because we were caught so unaware. And if we had understood what was happening, we could have tried to go back in the woods and at least treat some of those large trees. And I'm just really heartbroken that we lost them. But being sort of an optimist, and seeing what had happened, it left me sort of resigned to, or resolved to try to see if there was something that I could do at Vanderbilt, because Vanderbilt does have a lot of really great ash trees on the campus. So in 2014, I had my students, I had a whole army of students, about 350 students, and we divided them up into squads basically, and sent them to different places on campus where the GIS database had said that there were ash trees. And so their job was basically to find out, is there really an ash tree there? And if so, how big is it? So we were able to take the data they collected when we got back in the lab, and we created some maps showing where the white and green ashes were and what their sizes were. And we were able to then present this information to the campus landscape architect who's in charge of the Arboretum, and with a suggestion that they should plan ahead for when the emerald ash borer came to Nashville. Little did we know in the spring of 2014 that very fall, the emerald ash borer would jump several counties from the east and be detected in the Old Hickory area in the fall of 2014. So it was actually quite great that we had done this, this survey, because we were able to recommend what some of the trees are that where the large trees were, that were in good locations where they're likely to survive. And around 2016, a few years after that, then the campus did do some treatments to try to save some representative examples of the large ash trees on campus. And I just wanted to highlight that this is a picture that I just really love. This is one of my favorite trees on campus. This big tree here is the largest ash tree at Vanderbilt in 2020. And here's a photo from 1925. If you look at this tree here carefully and compare it with this one, you can tell it's the same tree. So even in 1925, it was a large tree, although not as large as it is now. And based on some sleuthing that I was able to do, we're pretty sure that that tree was planted around the time when Vanderbilt was founded in around 1875. So this is one of the trees that that we were able to hopefully save. So that's just to kind of segue from talking about forests that I love in Ohio to the forests that I love here in Tennessee. So Heather already has mentioned that although the ash trees are not perhaps as predominant as they are in the forests in Ohio that I mentioned, they are very common trees. Here's a photo of a white ash. This is actually on the edge of a cedar glade, but white ashes are basically found everywhere. And then here's a photo of a nice big green ash where you can see its very distinctive bark. And so once you learn to recognize the bark, you realize, I took a trip through Radnor Lake last year and realized how many large ash trees there were along the trail that I could notice by their bark. White ash and green ash are found to have approximately 100% mortality from the emerald ash borer. They basically, once they're infected, they do not survive. The third species of ash that we have here, blue ash, which is called Fraxinus quadrangulata because it has these square stems, as you see over here, does a little bit better. I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's only 75 or 80% mortality, which is still pretty horrific, but not 100%. And this is, I believe that this arrow here is actually the tree that I took the photo of over here. So blue ash are actually quite common in the cedar glades around the edges. So if you're in that part of the basin, you're likely to see blue ashes. So anyway, it's an important part of our Tennessee ecosystem. And I guess that's a good time to segue into talking about what's going on in the parks.
Thank you, Steve, so much. Before we do that, I thought it would be a lot of fun to have another poll. So this one is, let's see. about metro parks. So I hope you're ready. How much public park land does Metro maintain? And by maintaining, I mean mowing, keeping up the structures, making sure electricity works everywhere. How many acres? I want to share this with you while you're answering. When I moved to Nashville back in October of 1999, maintenance took care of over 10,000 acres. So, you know, 5,000 isn't the right answer there, whoever answered 5,000. So let me, Carissa, I'll get to your question and share that with Steve in just a second. Let me end this, share this. And we do have a question in the chat, Steve, about treatment, but I believe that Rick's presentation might just answer that. So guys, be thinking about your questions for Steve regarding the biology of and ecology of emerald ash borers in the Tennessee forest. In the meantime, I've got to introduce my friend Rick Taylor. Rick is Assistant Director of Maintenance for Metro Parks here in Nashville. And I am forever indebted to Rick because in 2017, thank you, Carissa. In 2017, when the Nature Center Learning Center building was hit by lightning and the chimney blew up, Rick was at the Nature Center pretty much every day for 2 weeks at 6 o'clock in the morning, helping us out. He is a great partner of natural areas. He's a great partner of Warner Park Nature Center. And Rick, I'm so excited to have you here.
Okay, I had to unmute there. Thank you, Heather. I really appreciate the nice introduction. And Steve, that was spectacular. I enjoyed listening to that. Again, my name is Rick Taylor. I've been working with Metro Parks for about 29 years, and I oversee the maintenance division, which we have about 160 employees in our division. I'm very grateful for Heather asking me to do this. This is actually new for me, first time, and also kind of fun. So I'll dive right into what we're kind of doing. Well, first I'll talk about what we have in Davidson County. So right now, 6%, as you know, is the tree canopy in Davidson County that has ash trees. That equals to about 1.6 million trees. And for the most part, they're going to have, 100% kill rate, except for what Dr. Baskauf talked about, the blue ash. We're hoping that the blue ash will be able to stick around when this is all said and done. In Tennessee, compared to the state of Tennessee, there are about 270 million ash trees. So that's a lot of trees that this state is going to actually lose over the next 5 to 10 years. And that's going to be very, very hard to replace, and it's going to be very costly. Metro government has about 18,000 acres in total, and 16,000 of the acres belongs to the Parks Department, so we oversee that. And as Dr. Baskauf mentioned, the first time the ash borer was noticed or identified in Tennessee was around 2014. So there's a graph here. I think Heather's going to show this. It's the percent ash mortality from EAB. And Davidson County is somewhere in the 8 to 9 years range here on this graph. So we're in a bad spot right now. We're about to start seeing probably some trees dying and falling here exponentially over the next 2 to 5 years. So that's going to be a tough situation for this city because we're going to have to deal with it. And so I'll talk about the EAB working group, Emerald Ash Borer Working Group, and this is the departments that are involved with this. And we have been meeting and discussing the EAB issue since 2017. we did do a educational seminar to the department heads in 2017. And we've also been doing some education and outreach to the citizens of Nashville through mailers. NES does mailers. I believe Piedmont Gas did some mailers. Public Works and Metro Water also do some public service announcements, and brochures have been disseminated throughout. I think we have some at the nature centers, and then there's a lot of social media and website information that's available. But you can see there's a lot of departments and that are associated with this. Water Services has an urban forester that works in that division that's also assisting us with this this issue. We did develop an EAB management plan, and that was given to the council and the administration in 2020. I believe it was July. So that's some of the stuff that the city has been doing, and we're still asking for funding to actually attack this problem that we're going to have here coming up the next 5 years. So I can talk a little bit about what Parks has done. We started an inventory, a tree inventory with Davy Resource Group, and they have a bunch of arborists that go out and walk your property, and they identify the trees, the ash trees, and they will mark them in our software called Tree Keeper, and it's a GPS system that the tree will be located in, on the map, and you'll be able to go back and see it. And so the information that they gather are going to be the type of tree, the size of the tree, the risk assessment of the tree, and they'll give it a score. And basically we have a low, medium, and high risk trees. And so you will see these blue dots that Heather has shown a picture here. And I can't take credit for this PowerPoint slide either, because Heather did this for me. It was nice of her to do that. So, but the blue dots are mostly on the ash trees. However, while Davy Resource Group was doing work in our park system, we went ahead and took advantage of them being there and went ahead and have them mark also hazardous trees, other trees that are risky, that are identified that we probably will have to remove. I think that is a honey locust, is that right? Okay, I'm not a tree person, so I'm just guessing here. But so that's why you see the blue dots. And so we have spent about $225,000 to date doing inventory, and that's done about 18% of our property. We've done about 115 or so parks and service locations, and some of those service locations could be like playgrounds and sports fields or trailheads and things like that you guys are familiar with. So we have probably 500 plus service locations in the park system, but we're right around 200 parks total. So we have more work to do. We have removed some ash trees. Our tree crew, headed up by Randall Lance, our horticulturalist on staff, they do remove ash trees, but as you know, that if we have 1.6 million of them, and there's a certain percentage of those that we'll actually have to physically remove, whether it's our team or a contractor, that's going to be an enormous task. And there's nobody that works for Metro right now, whether it's Public Works or Water or Parks, that can actually handle the load that's going to come our way with tree removal. So we've also treated some trees, and it is time consuming, and you have a small window to do it. You basically inject the tree with an insecticide. I believe it cost us around $400 a liter. You have to do that sometimes every 1 year, but usually every 2 years. And the amount of insecticide that you use is based on the size of the tree. You have to do that in the spring, generally while the trees are leaving out. So you have a small window to do it. And it is time consuming. It takes probably on average a half a day to do one tree. Usually 2 people are doing it. So It's not an easy thing to do, and it can be expensive, especially if you're going to do this at home and hire a contractor. It can be, you know, $500 to a couple $1,000 depending on who you hire and how big your tree is. So it is not cheap, and it's something, once you do it, you're committed to it. So if you want to keep the tree alive. We've also had a lot of meetings. Councilwoman Angie Henderson has been involved with a lot of our meetings. She's did pass a resolution to do some education on the emerald ash borer in 2019, bringing that awareness to the council committee as well as the administration. So she's working hard to try to help this city and educate this city, as well as, you know, advocate for funding for us to deal with the problem. So what we need to do now, I guess we just need to really continue to fund and remove the high priority trees. And if I can go down what we have right now, we've done, of that 18% inventory that we've done, there's, in all of parks, we've identified 575 high priority trees to date. So 8,496 total ash trees that are that have been identified. And again, we're not going into the woods, deep into the woods. We're looking at areas that we would call target areas, you know, where people are, where facilities are, where assets are, playgrounds, parking lots. We're trying to look for areas where a tree could potentially fall and either harm a person or property. So trees that are in the middle of the woods, where out in the middle of Warner, out in the middle of Beeman, they're just going to fall. So that's the best practice. That's what most people have done in other states and counties that have been dealing with this problem. And then for those of you who are interested about Warner, Warner has about 7,400 ash trees, and we identified about 400 as high priority. So Warner's going to lose a lot of trees, and you know, we're actually, Nashville's going to lose a lot of trees over the next 5 years, and it is going to be pretty devastating in terms of the tree canopy here. We've lost a lot from the tornado this past year, and we've had some other weather issues that have caused us to lose other trees. But to go back on to what we really need to do is we need to continue to remove those high priority trees. We need to find ways, you know, to get this this project to be funded and fully fund it. So right now, what we believe we need is about 1.5 million just to complete the inventory of the park system. We just submitted from the EAB working group requesting a $3 million supplement to handle the inventory for the entire county for that's government property, as well as start, you know, paying contractors to assist us with removing trees. And then once we have the complete inventory for the county, then that allows us to do a complete budget. Because until you know how many trees you have to remove, it's really hard to develop a budget. We're estimating anywhere between 10 and $20 million. We really don't know. It could be very expensive. So, you know, tree crews are expensive, and, you know, the use of equipment. Sometimes you'll have to use a bucket truck. Sometimes you're going to have to go into areas that are tight, can't get equipment in. You might, you know, especially on some of the trails where we invite people in, if a trail is perimeter trails in a, you know, a high use area and there's a tree right there, we probably have to remove it. So then you know, we have to develop the entire process of removing, disposing, and of course repurposing the wood. So that's a lot. It's not just removing the trees. In some cases we can let them sit in the woods, but there are other cases we just can't do that. So and then another thing we would like to see with whatever resolution that the council comes up with is a tree planting plan, some funding there, because we would like to start planting trees now. And of course, you know, the city has this, I don't know, was it 500,000 trees over the next 20 years or so, but we probably need to plant more after this. And so find the tree planting plan for this, as well as a maintenance plan for 2 years after those trees are planted, because as you know, a lot of people will plant trees, but we need to be able to maintain those trees and keep them alive for the next 2 years. So that's pretty much all I have. I'm not as filled with a lot of good stuff that Dr. Baskauf had, but this is what we're doing. This is what your city's doing. And, you know, if you have any influence whatsoever, I mean, it's, you know, contact your council person and let them know. And this is important, and Nashville needs to do more right now. And it's getting close to becoming where it will be bad if you follow that ash tree mortality rate. So we're getting close. And I'm not an expert, so I'm not a botanist or a horticulturist or an arborist. Steve may know more about this type of stuff, as he experienced it personally, as well as, you know, he studied this as well. And I'm just here trying to facilitate this process so that we can make our parks safer. So I'm pretty much done. If there are questions, hopefully I can answer them, and I'm sure Steve can probably answer most of them.
Before we get to questions really fast, I just want to make sure, because we might have people dropping off as we get closer to 7 o'clock, to thank both of you, Dr. Baskauf and Rick. You guys are great friends of the Nature Center. You're great friends of parks, and you speak for the trees. So thank you so much. Steve, you had something to share?
Yeah, several things came to mind while Rick was talking. So what the question that came up in the chat was, does treating ash trees cause harm to native insects and animal species? So the two, I think, main ways that the ashes, so as I said, the real damage is done to the tree on the inner bark. And so if you say spray the outside of the tree with an insecticide, it's not going to do anything. That's why they have to do either an injection, or some people use like a soil drench and then it goes up through the roots. And so the insecticide is going to primarily be on the inside of the tree. So if you have animals on the outside of the tree, like squirrels and birds and, you know, things like that, are not going to be directly affected. If it's an insect that like sucks the juice out of the leaves or something, then it's possible that they might be affected. But, you know, like the neighboring trees are basically not going to be affected. And, you know, there are certain insects that are specialists for ash trees. And, you know, those insects will probably be killed by the insecticide, but then they would also be killed when the ash tree dies. So it's really kind of a question of, like, you know, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And, you know, so a lot of people have just opted for trying to keep that piece of the ecosystem in there. The other thing that I was going to say, I didn't really sort of talk about the future. I mean, the future looks very grim, but one of the things, the real hope for the future is to try to get biological control. There's been experiments with pathogens and parasitoid wasps that will that are specialists on the emerald ash borer. Obviously, you have to be really careful bringing in pests from like China, because you want them to be specialists. You don't want them to attack our native insects. But there are several candidates, and so there's some research on introducing those to try to get the numbers down. And one of the things that was interesting, we were actually up at my father-in-law's on this early fall, and my wife was walking around with him and was kind of shocked to see a lot of little ash trees coming up. So there were ash seeds in the seed bank that were coming up. You know, what their ultimate fate is, it's hard to say, because, you know, they're small. And the thing is, once you have this big wave of destruction going through, then and the ash populations crash, then the ash borer populations are also going to crash. So those little trees that are coming up at this point really aren't experiencing very much pressure from the emerald ash borer, because the emerald ash borer has like more or less died out. So there's some possibility that there could be, especially if there's some introduced predators, that there might be some kind of equilibrium that would be established between them and the ashes and the ash borers. So it's not necessarily a given that the ash trees are going to go extinct, but it's possible that they could persist. The other thing that's very interesting is that the rate at which things are happening here in Tennessee is a lot slower than Ohio. I mean, within probably 4 years of it arriving in my hometown, there were already dead trees, and it's been, well, what, 8 years now, and there are some trees showing signs of distress. So it's not entirely clear what the reasons are for it to slow down, but there is some hope in terms of like ecological research and looking for natural predators, that there could be some hope for the future. And so I think the people, you know, you are basically, if you decide you're going to go down the road of treating the trees, you are basically committing potentially to doing that forever. Although once 99% of the trees die and, you know, your ash tree is the only one around, the pressure from the ash borer is going to be less, and it's possible that they wouldn't have to be treated as often because there simply wouldn't be as many ash borers around. So it's kind of remains to be seen what the future is, but it's not necessarily completely bleak, although it's pretty bad. So I don't know if that answered any questions, but that's some more thoughts I have about sort of the future. But the other issue that's sort of related directly here is that you really don't want to wait until all the trees are dead and falling down to try to remove all of them. You know, that's why making a decision now and getting started on removing the ones that aren't going to be saved sort of keeps you from having a panic later.
Rick, did you have anything else to share? I think I cut you off earlier.
Oh no, I'm good. I agree with Steve. You know, hopefully we will have some ash trees that survive, but then we do have a large project here as a city to take on that, you know, is going to be a tough thing to watch. You know, I know, you know, people, they always poke fun at us because we're cutting trees down, but we don't really like cutting them down. But some of the trees that we have to take down that are damaged, diseased, and unsafe, we remove them. But we're also planting trees all the time, and you know, hopefully, you know, I've listened to him, Steve, talk about the wasp, and that's been brought up. And I guess I have a question for Steve: is there an unintended consequence with the wasp? I mean, you're talking about, could they cause harm to the environment other than, you know, what the intended purpose is for?
Well, it's actually very interesting because the regulations for introducing biological control agents are like 10 times more stringent than introducing other insects. So for example, like, you know, that stupid Asian ladybug that they introduced, like somebody just brought it in and let it loose, and I think the USDA did it, and there were really no rules against that. Whereas the establishment of a pest control insect is a lot stricter. And so one of the things they're looking for are parasitoid wasps. And the thing about parasitoid wasps is they're very, very host specific. So a lot of parasitoid wasps are specialists on a single species. So I'm not really up on the species that they're using or that they're testing. I think there's about 3 of them. And they may not be strictly specialists on the emerald ash borer, but on other kinds of wood-boring insects in the same like family. So it's possible there might be some cross attacking of similar insect species that are native, but they're not going to go after butterflies or, you know, some other. They would be going after wood-boring beetles that are very closely related if anything else. So I think that if the researchers do their job, that the biological control is like pretty safe, just because it's very strictly regulated.
Hey guys, we're about to go over our time, so I again want to thank you. Participants, if you guys have more questions for